So my name's Carolyn Thompson. I'm the Director of Family Preservation and Family Safety for ACWA. And it's my privilege to give an acknowledgement of country today. So ACWA acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the unceded lands that we meet on today. So we acknowledge with great respect the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the local lands on which our office is located. And we also pay our respect to their elders past and present and emerging. And we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be in the room today or who have joined us online. So I just want to get a thumbs up to make sure that our live stream is active and that we're all good. Dom, can you just give me the thumbs up to make sure our live stream is active? Brilliant. Sounds great. Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to today's event, those who are here in the room and those who are online. This is the second of ACWA's Strategy to Action Days for 2024. And Strategy to Action Days are a really important event for ACWA. They're an opportunity for ACWA members and other stakeholders from our sector and also from adjacent sectors to come together to consider the critical issues for us to reflect together on how we can use our individual service and collective efforts to better support vulnerable children and families. Our last Strategy to Action Day focused on storytelling through data in the family preservation service sector, using data to illuminate children and families' experiences and needs and the outcomes and areas for further action. And in this morning's session, we are focusing on domestic and family violence and its impact on children and young people. And exploring ANROWS research about collaboration to better support families facing complexity in their experiences of domestic and family violence. And never has this been a more critical conversation to have. So this afternoon, we're going to have an in-person workshop with the ANROWS team, hearing from them and also contributing to their work by sharing children and young people's experiences of coercive control. And although today's afternoon session is being held in person only, it's our commitment that we'll be holding a further conversation with an online audience. So we're working on dates for that session, and we're putting the call out. We will put the call out through our Family Preservation Collaborative Network, and also for anybody who's registered online for this group. And we'll make sure that the dates for that are posted on our website as well. So if you're joining online and feel like you're missing out for that afternoon conversation, we would warmly encourage you to join us online. It's really important that we make sure that we have that hybrid event, but too challenging to manage in the format that we need to hold it. So we'll definitely have that. So before I introduce the team from ANROWS, I want to just cover some housekeeping. So we ask people to please note that we're live streaming and we are recording today's session. And we will break from 11 to 11:15. So for those who are online, please rejoin us at 11:15. Feel free to take a break in that space. And for those people who are in the room, we ask you to be back in the room promptly at 11:15 and seated so that we can rejoin with our colleagues online. So there is the opportunity for people who are online to ask questions in the chat, and my colleague Sammy is going to be moderating the online chat for us. So we will hold those questions until a point in the session when the ANROWS team are ready for them. But please know we may not get to all the questions, but we'll certainly endeavour to cover the broad themes of those questions. But nonetheless, the questions are important because they really give a hint of the kind of information that people need and are interested in. So I'm going to introduce the ANROWS team now. But before that, just to explain that ANROWS is the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety. For more than a decade now, ANROWS has created evidence to shift attitudes, support practice and influence reform and effect lasting impact and ensure the safety of women and children. They commission and produce and translate evidence and provide evaluation services and consultation everywhere in Australia on everything domestic, family and sexual violence. And they've become an absolute cornerstone of the research and practice communities. So we're privileged to have with us today Sophie Gillfeather-Spetere, who is a Senior Project Officer at ANROWS, where she focuses on evidence translation for policymakers and practitioners. Sophie has a master's from the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney, where her research is focused on the role of feeling policy and practices on young parents' experiences with government and non-government organisations in New South Wales. She's a former public servant who's worked in policy and practice with children and young people, and particularly in the child protection in the out-of-home care space. And we also have with us from ANROWS, Amy Watson. Amy's a Senior Project Officer with ANROWS. She works to make evidence accessible and applicable for practitioners and policymakers who are responding to domestic and family and sexual violence. Sophie has an honours degree from the University of Adelaide, where her research focused on discourse analysis of Australian sexting education programs targeting adolescents. And so Amy has a particular interest in understanding the lives of children and young people as they are experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence. So we welcome Amy and Sophie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Amy. It's my colleague, Sophie. Thank you very much for the introduction, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here today. We're both really excited to speak to and with you to share the learnings from ANROWS research and to listen to the abundance of expertise that's in the room today, and also for those joining us online. So I'd just like to take a moment to echo Carolyn's acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land that we're meeting on today, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to pay my respects personally to elders past and present, and to any First Nations colleagues joining us today. So, as Carolyn said, ANROWS is Australia's national research organisation for women's safety, and key to our role is building the knowledge base on domestic, family and sexual violence. But it's also really important to us that we don't just produce the evidence, we really want to make sure people can use it. And we're very invested in building that knowledge base alongside victim survivors and practitioners. And that's why it's such a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for having us. So as Carolyn mentioned, we'll have 3 sessions with you today. In session 1, we're excited to share with you a project that Sophie and I have been working on, which is bringing together recommendations from around 20 ANROWS research reports that are focused on children and young people's experiences of domestic and family violence. We'll then have a break for morning tea before coming back to talk about what we've learnt from research on the Safe and Together model, and to introduce you to some other evidence-based collaborative practice frameworks that might be useful in your work. We will then have lunch, chance to refresh, network, take a breather. And for those in the room today, we'll bring you back together in a workshop to discuss the evidence on children's experiences of coercive control. So that is an emerging field, and we really want to use this opportunity to share what the evidence says, while also building on this with your insights and perspectives. So throughout all 3 of the sessions, we will be inviting you to reflect, contribute and discuss with your colleagues. I like to flag that because sometimes when someone asks you to do that and you're surprised, it takes a moment to get into it. So we'll be doing this in person in the room, and also online using the Zoom chat. So we really invite you all to take advantage of who's in the room with you today. Just to add a few housekeeping notes to Carolyn's, we all in the room today have different experiences, expertises and priorities. We're hoping this will be a place where we can kind of share that knowledge freely and safely. And we just remind you to not share any client personal information today and to focus on your practice expertise and wisdom. Feel free to step outside or take a breather if you need to for the content. And we also understand that some of you may need to answer phone calls as you go. Just take a step outside to do that. That's completely fine. And just adding a note that obviously the Zoom chat conversation is visible to everyone. So just be conscious about what you're putting in there. So a quick note about language and why we use the words that we use. So at ANROWS, we use the term experiencing domestic and family violence to capture the full range of circumstances in which a child is living in a home and among family where there is domestic and family violence. This means that we believe that there are no circumstances in which children and young people are living with domestic and family violence and are not also being impacted. So as you all know from your work, domestic and family violence can profoundly affect children's everyday lives, as well as their ongoing growth, development, well-being and relationships. So to their self, to others, and to the culture and community. So we use this language of experience throughout rather than witnessing or exposed to acknowledge that children aren't secondary victims, but they're victims and survivors in their own right. All right. So, like I mentioned, over the last several years, ANROWS has commissioned and developed a body of work on children and young people's experiences of domestic and family violence. This year, we've been working to synthesise that body of work to draw from it the key recommendations and actions that are needed to embed this body of research into policy and practice. This process has shown us that there are 6 key themes emerging from the recommendations in this large body of work. There is the need to deliver targeted services and early intervention that meet the needs of children across sectors, the need to collaborate across systems to respond holistically to children's needs, to share knowledge across the disability, domestic and family violence, and children's safety sectors, to acknowledge and act on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's knowledge of what is best for their children, to invest in skill development in trauma and domestic and family violence informed care across systems and services, and to centre the voices, strengths, and needs of children and young people themselves. Our aim with this work is to make these research identified action areas a priority on government and policymaker agendas. But this has implications for practice as well, because these recommendations do require drawing on practitioner expertise to make sure that they're implementable in practice and are drawing on promising practices that align with the evidence on what is needed to ensure targeted, collaborative, culturally responsive services that really have children and young people at their core. So we aren't going to work through all 6 themes in this session. We're going to focus our discussion on the need for targeted services and early intervention, collaboration, and disability-informed practice. Focusing on these themes will give us a chance to talk through some of the core evidence on responding to children and young people and what that means for practice. And our second session today will give us time to touch on those other key themes by talking about models and frameworks for delivering domestic and family violence informed care, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander expertise, and centering children and young people. So, the first and most prominent theme to emerge from this body of research was the need for a targeted approach to children and young people's safety from domestic and family violence. Why? Why has this come out as the biggest theme, and what's the need? Well, everyone here today knows that domestic and family violence is very prevalent among families who are involved with child protection. But how significant do we think that problem is on a national scale? And we'd like to take a second to do a little activity here. We'd like you to think about what percentage of Australians you think have experienced domestic and family violence during childhood. Taking a second, take a note down. For those online, have a think, keep that number in your head. So the answer is almost 40%. According to the Australian Child and Maltreatment Study, which is the first nationally representative study of child maltreatment, 40% of Australians have experienced domestic and family violence as children. That's more than any other type of abuse, and it's almost half the population. So we'd like to take a second now for what I warned you about, our discussion. For anyone who chose a score or was thinking about a score that was lower than 40, I'd like to invite someone to share why they chose that. There's no judgment, but just interested to hear from your experience why you might have picked that. Would anyone like to volunteer? Show of hands, did anyone think it was under 40 or less than 40? Did anyone think it was much more than 40? And who does that kind of sound right for? It's reflecting your experiences. I saw a nod when I was talking. Thank you. Are there any comments from the Zoom at this point? Beautiful. So why do we start the discussion today with this number? It's because it's a number from Gold Standard Research, which is this landmark study measuring prevalence. But there's also more research in this area too. So recent figures from a New South Wales-based study found that 33% of children reported to New South Wales Child Protection Helpline had experienced domestic and family violence. So that figure was based on what was reported, but also what the case files identified via assessment or case notes. And we'd like to take a second now to think about what are we curious about when we see those two figures together. So does it make us think that the rate is higher than what's visible in child protection records? What do we need to be curious about and open to with the children that we're working with? And I'll just open that up to the room and to the Zoom chat if anyone has any thoughts on those two figures at this point.
It makes me think many children who experience domestic violence do not, are not involved in the child protection.
So for those online, we've just had a comment that many children and young people who are experiencing domestic and family violence might not be visible to the child protection system, which is a great point. There's a big kind of gap there. And we think about almost 10% of the adults that we've spoken about are not visible in that number. Sam?
It's had a few comments in the Zoom chat about the initial number, and some people noted that they thought it might be more 65 to 60%.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you to those online. All right, I'll hand over to my colleague Sophie now to talk us through some of the more specific impacts of domestic and family violence for children.
Thank you. So I guess we want to move now to what is some of the evidence supporting this particular call for action. So we want to talk about mental health impacts and mental health services specifically. We got this right? No. One more. Here we go. So in an ANROWS study, researchers looked at children born in Western Australia between 1987 and 2010, and they used police and health records to follow these children from their birth through to 18 years, looking at whether they had experienced domestic and family violence, been in contact with a mental health service, or received a mental health disorder diagnosis. And these researchers found that children who had experienced domestic and family violence were almost 5 times more likely to receive treatment from a mental health service by the time they turned 18 compared to a child who had not experienced violence. So that's 79% compared to 16%. So pretty big gap there. So on the one hand, knowing what we know about the mental health service access in this country, really, this finding should actually give us a little bit of hope, right? Because at the very least, these kids were receiving some sort of support for their mental health issues. But that rate of 5 times more likely indicates that there is a significant increased need for mental health supports for children and young people when there is domestic and family violence. And this finding, which I'm about to share, shows that those supports are coming far too late. So the team also found that there is a 6-year gap between a child's experience becoming known to police or to a health service provider, so an emergency department, a GP, and children receiving a mental health response. On average, children's experiences of violence were visible in this police or hospital data around age 6, yet they only received a health service on average around age 12. So just sit with that, right? Because I don't think that a lack of mental health services or the fact that mental health has an impact, domestic and family violence impacts children's health is a surprise to anyone, but just sit with that number of a 6-year gap. And just think of the significant developmental changes a child is going through over that period of time. Think of a child you love, think of a child you're working with, think of the major school transitions, the massive and expected ordinary leaps in learning and socialization, puberty, and then consider that if these children are becoming visible to police and health because of domestic and family violence at an average age of 6, then we can assume that for many of these kids, there has been a pattern of control and violence used by a parent towards another parent for a significant period of time prior to that experience, reaching the point that a police officer or a health worker has recorded it as possible domestic and family violence. Now, also think of why they're coming into contact with mental health services on an average age of 6. What's happening at an average age of 12? What is happening for those children at that time of their life? Like, could it be that things have been bubbling away under the surface for this period of time over middle childhood and then through to puberty? You have transitions to high school. You have other big developmental changes. You have children becoming physically larger, right? And then all of a sudden you're just like flipping the lid and there is suddenly greater visibility of what had been there all along in terms of this trauma response. And if we look at the kind of mental health issues that are more prevalent in children and young people who have experienced violence, they are significant and complex issues deeply related to how these young people are responding to trauma. So children who have experienced domestic and family violence are 1.6 times more likely to intentionally self-harm. They are 1.8 times more likely to be diagnosed with a personality disorder, and they are twice as likely to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. The study also explored the relative mental health risks for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. And this part of the study compared the diagnoses of First Nations children who had experienced violence to First Nations children who had not. And it found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who had experienced domestic and family violence were more likely to intentionally self-harm than non-Indigenous peers in the DFV cohort. No, we don't have another slide for that, Carolyn, but thank you for reminding me. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander who had not experienced domestic and family violence, they just did not have that increased risk. This is major, right? Like we have a serious national issue of First Nations children, suicidality and self-harm. And this study shows that domestic and family violence is likely a driving force behind that. We just had a progress report of the Closing the Gap released today, and it shows that we are not advancing far enough in this. So what does this tell us? The profound effect of domestic and family violence on children's mental health and that huge gap in services to support their healing and recovery is just one example of the ways that children are victims and survivors of domestic and family violence in their own right, yet their needs are just not adequately being seen or assessed or responded to. And responding to the mental health needs of children who are victims of violence is also a key action in preventing the perpetration and re-victimization of domestic and family violence as they move into, being an adolescent in their own intimate partner relationships and as an adult as well. Because we know that there are these intersecting issues of past experiences of trauma and then future violence or victimization. So this early intervention piece is really something we need to get right. So again, activity for you all, an opportunity to sit and reflect, because I know we've just thrown a lot at you. We'd like to invite you to reflect on those findings for a minute, using the Zoom chat again, or also just turning to the people next to you. Take some time to think about and share your thoughts on the following questions. So where do you see the biggest lack of services and supports for children and young people experiencing domestic and family violence? And 2, what would look different if children and young people's needs were centred in our national response to domestic and family violence? What would be different for them? What would be different for their families? And what would it make it possible for you as a practitioner to be able to do? We'll call you back in a few minutes, but yeah, just take an opportunity to sit on that. So who is feeling courageous enough to maybe share back some of their thoughts? Where is the need? And if we were filling this need, what could look different? Yeah. Is there a microphone?
Thank you. Yeah, we talked about the obvious need for that whole of family support to be addressing the domestic and family violence in addition to the mental health needs of the children. That was, it's quite an obvious gap in our service system. It's being able to appropriately support and hold accountability where it lies, but also provide the support and the safety from a whole of family perspective.
Yeah, yeah. And there's definitely a lot of evidence supporting the need for those whole of family supports. And I guess, did you have an opportunity to also reflect on what would look different if we were able to be providing whole of family supports to children? And
Well, did you?
Oh. I think that what we've focused on is that, that glaring gap of, services to support men to change their behaviour. And the trajectory is fairly obvious on what would look different for kids.
Yeah.
But it's starting to get to the stage where we really need to move into that area.
Yeah.
If we're going to make any significant change.
Yeah. We absolutely need to be bringing fathers to the table as not just as people using violence, but as caregivers, as fathers, they're dads, they're members of communities. And yeah, they need to be brought in. Thank you so much.
Hi, I actually work with the Salvation Army, and we use 2 programs that engage with the person who uses violence.
Mm-hmm.
They're not well known, but we actually talk about the intergenerational trauma and violence that they've all experienced, and how that if we can bring to them the understanding of what their impacts are doing to their children. And we have had success in both programs. Both have been running for, one's been running for 12 years and one's been running for now 6 years.
Yeah.
But this is why we're here, for the more evidence-based to incorporate into it, because we actually offer it to other organisations, but it hasn't been taken up.
Oh, that's great.
But we've been stating, and we've just spoken with people from America who say that to change it, you need to change how you see a person who uses violence.
Yeah.
Use more to it.
Yeah. There needs to be some of that, whilst holding accountability, minimizing that shame and not having that be a buffer, and really working alongside. If you want to talk to us about ANROWS and evaluation possibilities for those programs, please do. Great. So yeah. And we'll also mention that ANROWS is currently, we've just announced 13 new research projects that focus on people who use violence, including an evaluation of pilots that focus on bringing dads into the picture, doing that kind of whole of family responses to domestic and family violence as well. So we're going to really be looking forward to be able to share those results. Yep. One more.
Just the second one there. I think children's voices need to be listened to a lot more. There's stories, a lot of that circle work, particularly in Aboriginal communities. I think there's a lot of tick and flick around children's participation. It's not really genuine enough. So, and I think what would it look like? Children would be a lot happier. They would be a lot safer. There would be a lot more optimism, if you like. They would be confident, and the values of children would be far more at the forefront than they are now.
Yeah, I really agree, and really thank you for making sure that we're bringing back children into the conversation as well. I do think that piece around how do we make sure that we're building those skills of talking to children of all ages across all developmental abilities about difficult things, and not doing tick-a-flick participation, really learning to understand them, is also really integral to this assessment of the impacts of domestic and family violence. How do we understand what a child is experiencing and the impact it is specifically having on them if we're not having that deep communication with them, which doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. It needs to be, because children of all ages, it needs to be developmentally appropriate for that child. Thank you, everyone. Is there anything online?
Yes, there's been quite a bit of activity in the chat, which is great to see. So Nicole has said the supports and early intervention when the family comes into contact with services. Vicky has said health services usually won't provide mental health support to children in domestic and family violence due to the lack of safety and lack of perpetrator consent,
Yep.
and that this is a massive gap in health support for children and young people.
Yeah.
There are a few more, but some of the key ones: base service structure around children experiencing family and domestic violence in their own right, educate police, other services to comprehend that, and a few comments about increased support, services, funding, and early intervention.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Sam. All incredibly important points. Thank you, everyone online. And really that piece around massive service gaps based on different policies for service providers of who they work with and when. Definitely something that is deeply affecting children and young people, and also something we'll bring up when we talk a little bit later about the need for disability, domestic and family violence to work more closely together in response to children.
Thank you, everyone. That's really, really interesting for me to hear all of your perspectives on that. So I appreciate once again your generosity with speaking to each other and speaking to us today. And thank you very much to those online for being what sounds like very busy in the chat. So I'd like to take a second now to move to our next theme from the synthesis of the research we've been doing. So the second theme to emerge from this review of recommendations was the urgent need for cross-systems collaboration in pursuit of holistic responses. So we've seen that already start to come out of the conversation we're having in the room today. So the key actions emerging from this theme were the need to deliver holistic services and system responses that address multiple needs, the increased visibility of children in adult-centred services. And by that, I mean alcohol and other drug services, mental health services that are working with parents, but also the broader public systems that don't have a child focus embedded into their DNA, like policing and most areas of health. So again, reinforcing what you've already said today. And we also need to respond to children both as victims and survivors and as people using violence, and to get comfortable with where there isn't a binary between those two. So we as a sector talk a lot about complex and co-occurring issues. It's an interesting way of talking because it can assume that there is some desired state where there isn't complexity, where families are dealing with just one singular issue. And we know that that just doesn't fit with reality. But at the moment, key services working with families are often siloed. There is a real lack of visibility in children in adult-centred services. And there is a real need to build a DFE-informed workforce that includes knowledge and expertise in children and young people's experiences. So let's take a second to talk through some of the research that shows us why that's the case. This one is very close to home for us in New South Wales. So for a child in New South Wales, the risk of entering out-of-home care doubles when they're experiencing domestic and family violence, parental substance use, and parental mental health issues. And that's when we control for all other variables like child age, the number of children in the family, socioeconomic status, and disability, and so on. So here are a few more statistics pulling up to a national level that help to cement this need to break down the service silos. Recently, ANROWS and the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network released the nation's first study on filicides, which is the killing of a child by their parent. And this looked at where there was an identifiable history of either intimate partner violence or child abuse. This analysis of child homicides by a parent found that not only are filicides gendered, but there's often a constellation of issues within families in the period before a filicide. And we call these domestic and family violence context filicides. So to set the scene, 68% of filicide offenders in a domestic and family violence context were male and 32% were female. So firstly, I will note that male offenders were more likely to be the primary perpetrator of domestic and family violence, and female offenders were more likely to be a primary victim. Among these offenders, women were more likely to be experiencing mental health issues, with 72% of female offenders compared to 48% of male offenders. Men were more likely to be experiencing issues with alcohol and other drugs. Women were more likely to have experienced childhood domestic and family violence, and men were more likely to have a violent criminal history. So there's clearly a number of complex and intersecting factors that are happening in these families. And among these families, there were multiple services that had contact with them and varying levels of engagement across the group. So over half of the filicides that occurred in a domestic and family violence context contained a record of prior contact with general health services, police, and child protection services. Other key points of contact included mental health services and maternal health services. And despite relatively high levels of substance use in these families, only 13% had contact with alcohol and other drug services. So what can we glean from these findings? Firstly, they indicate that there is no single solution and collaborative responses are required to wrap around families without shame to respond to this. We know that contact doesn't equal engagement, but at the same time, these points of contact are opportunities to build engagement and curiosity about children, young people, and their families' experiences of violence. So in short, understanding and responding to children and young people's experience of domestic and family violence needs to be core business across our service sector so that it doesn't fall to just one sector like child protection alone. This means building domestic and family violence capability across a range of services from education and general health to specialist therapeutic services. And this is necessary if we're going to make children and young people visible as victims in their own right. And that's even when they're not in the room. So like we've said, with alcohol and other drug services for adults. And this is where the research points to the need to build that societal level acknowledgement that domestic and family violence is a parenting choice and that victims and survivors of domestic and family violence are also parenting under immense stress. Because to genuinely collaborate, there needs to be this foundation of shared understanding. And this can be built on a review of the philosophies, frameworks, mandates, pressures, evidence, and drivers that inform the different service systems that engage with children and families. This can help us to enable recognition of where these factors are contradicting with each other or are in tension with the principles of good practice. So, another chance to chat in the room. We'd like to invite you again to turn to the person next to you and discuss for a few moments Beautiful. Thank you, everybody. We're going to have another chance to kind of reflect back as a room. I'd like to go first to see whether there's anyone on the Zoom with any thoughts. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you. Yes. So Nicole has said, Nicole has said, I think more days like today are a great way to collaborate. Sharmili says, I 100% agree with you, Nicole, but as a sector development organisation, our experience has been that practitioners find it difficult and don't often have the time to attend communities of practice. All goes back to resourcing. Jenna has noted that we do see an overlap of perpetrators that are employed as police officers. And in response to Sharmili, Nicole said, yes, true, but even if we tried every quarter, that might try to fix the resourcing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And that's something we'll talk to in a bit more detail later is the need for resourcing to do so much of this work. It's not that the intent or that the desire to do it isn't there. It's about how much space we have to do that. I'll take a second. Does anyone in the room want to reflect on what you've spoken about with your colleagues?
I feel like we had this side last time, so maybe this side.
Yeah. The panic, the absolute panic. We talked a lot about, I guess, that having that shared language can be a really helpful thing and also a barrier. And I guess from our experience, that it does feel like there's an increase in DCJ and non-gov agencies having some commonality around that. We at Anglicare use the Safe and Together model and have found that a really helpful way of collaborating, even just understanding how to frame up to schools or other important adults in children's lives, the impact that family violence can have on risks that might seem separate. Like we talked about how violence can be the root of things like mum's mental health and drug use, and that those two things still in the sector feel very separate. And so I guess how we can improve on that is, I think there needs to be a sector-wide understanding that violence is often the root cause of all of these, like we describe them as symptoms. And I think that kind of links back to that 33% reporting as well. I was wondering about that, if that's actually more about the symptoms of violence are being reported without an underlying understanding that DV is actually a foundation that causes families to not be able to function in the ways that keep children safe. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much for that reflection. And I think as we spoke to earlier, we're obviously going to talk through the Safe and Together and some other models later that really do focus on how can we collaborate with that complexity. And there is, like you've said, a really strong need for that shared language and understanding. So I'll just hand over now to Sophie again. Or is there another? No. Hand back to Sophie to talk a little bit more about responding to disability and domestic and family violence across sectors.
Thank you, Amy. We're trying to not make you too dizzy with the double act, but yeah. So the third theme and the last one that we're focusing on today are really focused on children with disability and their experiences both as victim survivors of domestic and family violence, but also as young people using violence in the home, typically towards their mother or towards a younger sibling. And the studies informing this recommendation found that, among other things, that the needs of children and young people with disability who are experiencing violence are not currently being met. Children and young people's families and workers had to struggle, often for a long time, to get them the funding and support that they needed. Coordination was a massive theme, and just the mammoth effort required of workers and mothers to get those services and resources around. Another key recommendation was that children and young people with disability often become socially isolated if they experience domestic and family violence, and they can feel alone and believe that no one cares. And children and young people with disability need support quickly when they experience violence at home. It can't wait. And this support needs to be trauma-informed, and it needs to be child-focused. And they also need that support to help them recover. It's not a one quick fix. It's an ongoing support and recovery over that child's life. So children involved in this research told us that what was most important for practitioners to know from their perspective was that children with disability are always children first. They are loved and part of families that see their strengths and value, and they contribute important things to their families and to their communities. They also wanted practitioners to know that having safe adults in close circles of support helped them feel safe. And many did not feel that they had people outside of their families that they could turn to for this help. They also felt stressed and anxious about their everyday life and had relationships that were really worrying them. It's important that you know that this is language that young people and children with disability are using themselves to describe what they want. They also said it was hard for children and young people to have what matters to them heard when there was a lot going on in their family. They really felt like their voice could be particularly drowned out. And violence at home often caused a lot of change in families, unsurprisingly. And this is really hard. It was hard to keep friendships. It was hard to make new ones if they're being sort of, moved around as the result of the violence. And they also wanted practitioners to know that sometimes their feelings will come out in their behaviour, which can be hard for everyone. It's hard on them, it's hard for mum, it's hard for the siblings, and it's hard for workers as well. And children and parents found it very hard to get help with this particularly. So one study also made the following recommendations for services based on reflections from kids, mothers, and also practitioners working across the disability and domestic and family violence and child protection space. And these recommendations are that we need to put children first and realise that children and young people with disability have their own trauma, needs, likes and dislikes, and they are still very much part of their families even when they are not living with them. Workers need to better understand disability and the experiences of children and young people when there is violence at home. And when workers only think about one part of a child's life, like the violence or the disability, they can miss really important things and actually make things worse. They also recommended that good workers need good support too. So this means training and supporting workers in their jobs so that every worker can show up with kids with the right skills and the right knowledge and the right resources and energy behind them. Because I think everyone comes into this wanting to do the best they can, but the resourcing is often not there. And if you're not given that time to invest in your skills and knowledge growth, then, you know, that's not the fault of any individual worker. That's always the fault of a system that's not showing up for kids and families and for workers as well. Another study also focused on children with disability using violence and found that there were real tensions for service providers working with these families. DFV services just didn't have the frameworks to work with young people with disability using violence, and disability services were struggling to respond to not only a young person's use of violence, but also the high rates of trauma from their own experiences of violence as well. And we also know that because of this tension, because of this gap, a lot of these families will end up in the child protection system, right? Because there's no other space for them. And that's where they end up placing mothers in this awful position where they're often forced to have to make a decision between the safety of their younger children and having their younger children removed, or having the older child removed from the house, which is not what anyone wants. So we're down to our final reflection, but I know that we're running short of time, so we might just leave it for, there are the questions for you to reflect on there. Yeah, questions to reflect on. Maybe what we'll do is throw to Q&A. Do you think so? Yeah, rather than run over, so that we can have a break. So you have those questions, you can reflect on those in your own time. Do come and talk to us about what you want to know around disability more. We're really keen to hear it. But I'll let it open to the floor and also online if there are any questions more broadly.
I'm just interested in the practice frameworks and the lens that we use when we're intervening. Increasingly, I think we need a shared practice framework with disability and child protection and the intersection of that, because at the moment, if we're applying a trauma lens to a disability and a disability to a trauma lens, we're actually getting the wrong intervention for the wrong people to focus on the right things to get the best outcomes. So how can we come together across sectors to develop something that's smack bang in the middle that makes us look at our decision making?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think an incredibly valid point. One of the models that we will be talking about later today is a collaborative model, is it, for working with disability and domestic and family violence? Yeah. Is there anything online? No? Yeah, go Kate.
I guess I was curious if your research had found what we were finding in practice. So I was working with young people, many of whom had a disability and who were using sexual violence against other children. And what we often found was the intervention where those children were found by child protection not to be, it wasn't safe for them to remain in the home, was that they would then go and live with dad who had chosen to use violence against mum. And when you think about the use of sexually harmful behaviour, that one of the most significant risk factors of that is that these kids had experienced dad's choice to use violence against their mum, so then they're placed with dad. And I was just wondering if, that's what you had found in your research and whether that was discussed.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly, thank you, Kate. It's a great point. The research that looked particularly at children and young people who were using violence did find two key points that I think relate to what your question is. So not specifically, I don't have data specifically around what you're asking, but there's two interesting things. So one is that when children are using violence, 9 times out of 10, they have experienced victimization of domestic and family violence. So there's a huge overlap. That was a national quantitative study. The other thing that some research by Elena Campbell has found at the Centre of Innovative Justice is that when this idea of young people's use of violence in the home can be weaponized. That was weird. And now the mic's gone. I know it's back. The use of violence in the home can be weaponized by the perpetrator of violence, predominantly the father. And this can lead to the misidentification of the young person as the primary aggressor of violence in the household, and the risk criminalization of these children without the reflection of the fact that there is an adult perpetrator in the household using violence. And the third is the evidence to show us that housing stability, housing security, the lack of anywhere else to go, particularly for mothers and children with disability, is a massive barrier to being able to, I hate to use the phrase escape violence, because we all know that it escalates when you leave, but definitely to remove themselves from the home. So now we get to the part of our day where we actually start to dive in a little bit more to some of these models. So we're going to start with the Safe and Together model. The Safe and Together model is a suite of tools and interventions to support child welfare practitioners to deliver domestic and family violence informed practice. It was developed in the United States by David Mandel, and it is a child-centered, domestic and family violence specific approach to perpetrator risk identification, assessment, and management. The model is based on our understanding that children are impacted by violence occurring between parents in the home, or being used by one parent towards another parent in the home. And the model helps to inform practice by considering the impact of violence, men's violence on children, mothers, and the family. The model was initially adopted in the statutory child protection system in Queensland, and it has since been adopted, although to varying degrees, in other jurisdictions and in other service systems, including AOD services and family law, and it's being used in some of the NGO sector as well. The Safe and Together model really hinges on these three core principles: keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent, partnering with the non-offending parent as a default position, and intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to the child. And it's this concept of pivoting to the perpetrator, of making primarily men who are using violence visible. It's this concept that's particularly transformative in this approach to practice. So instead of focusing on the behaviour of victim survivors, typically mothers, and placing responsibility on them to keep their children safe from violence, including blame when they can't, this model instead positions domestic and family violence perpetration as a parenting choice by fathers and holds them accountable for that use. So just to take a second to reflect on those principles, again, turning to the people around you to have this conversation. Do these principles resonate with you and your work? Some of you might already be using Safe and Together or familiar with it to some degree, but just at a principle level, do these resonate with you and your work? And if they do, why? And if they don't, why not? For those of you online, again, please use the Zoom chat to tell us your thoughts. We'll come back in a few minutes, but go ahead. For my elderly lady eyes, this needs to be bigger because I am old. What glasses it off? She's She's just exceptional. 11, 19, 20. I'm just seeing like, yeah. That makes sense. Like I'm like just like absolutely, I don't know, I feel like a creature from like a cave. Like I have like light sensitivity, I have like stigmatism.
I just like can't really see. I just started that new glasses because my just not breaking the points. To some degree, it's either violence I feel like it's a cool great to just be able to see. So I got these. So they're in transition. Yeah. So they should also look. Yeah. Do you need a prescription? Yeah. Get your prescription. Yeah. Prescription. Am I moving it? All right, thank you, everyone. We might start. Are there any comments coming through online, Sam?
Yes, there are. So Nicole,
That's it.
so Nicole has said, I talk to these when delivering training to services, especially number 1. Vicky has said, these principles resonate with me, but I see a lot of work against these in my interactions with other services. And Nikki has said, these certainly resonate with the work we do and our service as a while. However, the ability to implement these principles becomes increasingly difficult with family law matters. Shamili has noted, I'm curious to find out how broadly these principles are embedded in earlier intervention services and programs.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sam. There was a lot of nods of acknowledgement in the room with that first one around, or the second one. I think I'm using them in my work, but I struggle to see them being used with the other service providers that I'm working with. Did anyone in the room talk about that? Or want to add any thoughts to that? No, just a shared acknowledgement, collective acknowledgement that that's part of the issue. Okay. Anyone in the room want to potentially share back a little bit about what they were discussing and how these do or don't resonate?
One of my reflections is that you know, about the extent to which you know, we take up these you know, these concepts and these practices as practitioners, but how are they embedded in policy and in the structures that kind of support the way we work? So, you know, for example, in structured assessments or decision-making tools or those kind of things, that maybe that needs to be an area of policy and practice that we reflect on.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carolyn. That idea of like strategic implementation of a model, what are the supporting architecture around a model to ensure that it can actually, you know, have the best chance to do the work that it's intended to do.
So, the Safe and Together model has been applied in some child protection systems, as we said, in Australia, and it has been the subject of ongoing research, including presently. The research was based on a recognition among domestic and family violence researchers, practitioners, and policymakers that the child protection system in Australia does not respond adequately to cases where domestic and family violence is present. And specifically that child protection systems tended to focus on mothers and expect them to undertake all of the protection work, even though mothers themselves were the victims of violence, did not engage with men, who in this context are predominantly perpetrators, did not have the skills required to use a domestic and family violence informed approach to child protection, and did not have the skills to identify patterns of coercive control or abusive and violent behaviour to understand the mother's response. And that's very much based on a kind of an incident-based response system. And conflate safety with separation of parents when it's known that separation is highly dangerous, and many men will be allowed significant unsupervised contact with children and lack strong collaboration with the domestic and family violence sector. So, in a piece of ANROWS research, workers from child protection and specialist DFE services reviewed a set of 20 child protection case files using the Safe and Together model to identify strengths, gaps, and needs. And case files in this research indicated poor engagement and intervention with perpetrators and missed opportunities to partner with the non-offending parent. This raised questions about how well domestic and family violence risk assessments or assessments of domestic and family violence were being done, and the quality of case decision making, case planning, and managing case complexity, where substance abuse, mental health, and cultural background were intersecting with domestic and family violence. This doesn't mean that practitioners don't want to do this work well. We work in this space because we care about children and their families, and we want the best for them and their safety and well-being. So if we know there are limitations in the way that we are currently working, what do we need support with to be able to do this better? So I want to pause here for a reflection again. This research is a few years old, and I do think that the child protection system and more broadly, the NGO and the statutory child protection system, they're not the same. They work differently, and there is a continuum of, I guess, skills and development and different approaches to practice. So just want to check in with people in the room if these tendencies or patterns are still resonating for you in the practice that you're seeing. I can see a couple of nods. Yeah. Yeah. So the issues still resonate. Yeah. All right. I'm going to pass over to Amy and just going to talk a little bit more about what the research tells us about what using the model can actually look like.
Thank you. All right. So let's take a second now to talk through what using the Safe and Together model can look like in practice. So research shows that the Safe and Together model can be effective when working with families experiencing domestic and family violence, including across statutory child protection, mental health, alcohol and other drug, and domestic and family violence services. So these findings are based on self-reported data from practitioners themselves, as well as the families that they're working with. So in this research, practitioners reported that using the Safe and Together model and the practice guides associated with it improved the quality of their practice. And for those in leadership positions, they reported that it improved their management of staff. So the guides that they're referring to include things like reflective questions, practice tips, quotations, and case studies, all of which can help to ground those principles and to guide practitioners in their work. So to step away from those self-reported improvements, the Child Protection Administrative data itself also points to improvements in child protection processes created through using this domestic and family violence informed approach. And young people, mothers and fathers identified positive differences in approach between workers who had been trained in the Safe and Together model when compared to workers with whom they'd had previous experiences. They mentioned significant changes in their families and spoke of being treated respectfully by practitioners. They noted that practitioners also had an increased recognition of the importance of assessing children, parenting and family function when providing domestic and family violence interventions. So to go into a little bit more detail, let's talk first about working with the non-offending parent. Practitioners explained that having a structured tool, such as the Safe and Together perpetrating mapping tool, really helped them to build relationships with mothers, particularly by identifying the behaviours of perpetrators and shifting that guilt and blame away from mothers. They also spoke to how this tool helped them work with perpetrators to explore the potential harm caused by their behaviours and to push back against that mother blaming that we've spoken about. Most participants in one research study said that they felt better prepared to apply that pattern-based approach in their practice with perpetrators and felt that they had strategies to help them manage the risk of collusion with perpetrators, which is a risk, obviously, when you start to work more closely. And across the research, the degree to which practitioners felt they'd improved their ability to focus on children did vary. In some studies, practitioners felt that their increased recognition of children's needs came out more as a side effect of their increased focus on the perpetrator and on partnering with women. However, in others, practitioners explained that using this Safe and Together model supported them to recognise the centrality of children in perpetrator patterns of power and control. They also spoke about how they could better understand and recognise the ways in which children are impacted by domestic and family violence and by parental alcohol and other drug and mental health issues. Practitioners reported improvements, particularly in their documentation practices. They described that their documentation improved in terms of capturing domestic and family violence by detailing the perpetrator's pattern of behaviour and its impact on children, partnering with the non-offending parent to record their protective efforts and the strengths and needs of children. So, what is needed for the model to be successful? And this is what we've started to touch on in terms of resourcing, authorising environment, and so on. So while these findings suggest that there is a potential for the Safe and Together model to help practitioners working with children and families to improve their DFE informed practice, we know this is great. But what do we need to make it happen and what is missing? So firstly, as I'm sure we're all aware, there is no single silver bullet that enables collaborative practice. It takes work across a lot of different areas to be successful. And while I say there is no single factor that guarantees success, an authorising environment is fundamental to the success of applying any model, and in particular through this research, the Safe and Together model. Practitioners universally told us that it was not possible to change their practice without organisational support for change and capacity building. That organisational support covered a wide range of areas. So the ability to create procedures and processes to enable this collaborative and domestic and family violence informed practice, to dedicate the additional resources needed to do that work, to provide worker training, supervision, mentoring, and communities in practice, to create space in practitioner workloads to actually do this work well, to support worker safety, particularly when working with perpetrators, and to authorise those collaborative partnerships between organisations. So it's clear that while changes do need to be championed by practitioners when working closely with families and their children, this work cannot be done without a genuine authorising environment at senior leadership and organisational level. So let's talk through some of those required elements in a bit more detail. So practitioners talked about the need for organisational commitment to change and capacity building. They noted that while they could strive for personal practice change, this needs to be supported by training and procedures at an organisational level, not only to be successful, but also to be sustainable. Staff said that they needed support to develop their skills and confidence, and that they also needed structure and processes to guide that work. For example, some practitioners spoke about their concerns navigating legal and statutory systems, and some felt that this part of practice was a minefield that was often left to individual workers to manage rather than authorised and guided at a senior level. Practitioners also spoke about the fact that senior levels of an organisation may recognise the need for practice innovation and change, but might not be considering the resource implications of that. They emphasise that there needs to be additional space and resources created in workloads to do this kind of considered work. And critically, there is a need for organisational change to support worker safety. So the Safe and Together model, like we've said, involves working closely with perpetrators of violence. And while this can bring benefits to the way that practitioners can support families, it also brings risks. Workers may be manipulated into colluding with the perpetrator or face threats to their personal, psychological, or professional reputational safety. Practitioners need to know that they have organisational support when doing this challenging work, whether this be literal support, so in the form of multiple practitioners being in a room when working with a perpetrator, or high-level support in the form of clear policies and procedures to follow. So some practitioners spoke about the fact that they were concerned that practitioners would use systems against them, such as by reporting them to their employer or making complaints. And so there needs to be that kind of organisational commitment and support to recognise that that might happen and a process to manage that. So we're going to ask you to reflect again. We've talked through kind of the authorising environment and everything that an organisation level can do. But that's just from this piece of research. So we're really interested to hear if there's anything that has been missed or that stood out really strongly to you. So I'll give you a chance just to talk among yourselves and reflect, and then I'll come back to the group and ask for a few to make a couple of comments. Oh, good. Would anyone else like to reflect? Yes, beautiful. Would someone mind? Yeah.
Where are these findings from?
These are Australian findings. Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a number of them that were run in Queensland, but also looking across a number of different jurisdictions. So New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and WA maybe. So there's been a suite of research. A lot of it has been led by Professor Cathy Humphreys that has looked at how the Safe and Together model can apply in Australia. And there's, as we'll talk to a bit later as well, there's work underway to look at how that might apply in Australia for different communities as well. I'm thinking about tailoring that. Did anyone else have any questions or reflections?
Are the people actually, or the people who are being trained? Because I think certainly there's a top-down invitation for this to be actually, but is there model drift or is it a very rigid framework that's not tinkered with, for want of a better word?
That's a great question. Sophie, do you have any ideas of that from the research that we've got? Or
I think that when what happens when there is action research like this is that there is a higher degree of fidelity to a model whilst it is in that pilot and research process, right? Because there is a resource investment whilst you're undergoing that period of investigation and analysis. Model drift will happen as soon as those resources are taken out. We see this consistently across action research, which is essentially research that is research teams sitting alongside a practice team and looking at how effective a model is. So I think it's an incredibly good point. I don't think that it would be interesting to go back and look at the discussion section of some of this research and to see what was pulled out, what kind of points Cathy Humphreys and the team made around model fidelity. I do know with Safe and Together, the principles themselves are kind of the fundamental basis, and then the tools which integrate those principles into it, like the perpetrator mapping tool, those are kind of the fundamentals of it. So there's a little room for ensuring that the way that the model is embedded in the particular service and the particular community that you're working with, there needs to be that degree of flexibility, but those underlying principles and some of the opportunities of those tools are kind of fundamental.
Having worked on those 5 projects as a researcher and working on the 2 current ones with Carly at TV New South Wales and Carolyn at ACWA, you are so right about the principles. It's really about the principles and really embedding the framework and the principles to your local context. And so what works for your service and what works for your state and what works for your community is how the model is intended to be set up. And it's using that perpetrator mapping, mapping the protective capacities of the mum and the kids, and using the support mechanisms of Safe and Together is what is most effective about it. Yeah, rather than doing a program logic comparison thing. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much all for those questions and for that discussion. Also very much appreciate the expertise in the room. So thank you very much. Stepping back a little bit from the authorising environment, I also want to just talk about some other considerations for success in using the model. I've lost here it is. So we know that practice and organisational change still needs to happen within a system. So while we have consistent evidence that the Safe and Together model can build practitioner confidence in recognising and assessing perpetrator behaviours, working with non-offending parents, and bringing children to the centre of responses, there are still limited options within the system to refer these individuals to appropriate services where it's needed. The research has also pointed to the need to consider the appropriateness of the Safe and Together model for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, families, and communities. So when working in the child welfare system, it is critical to consider the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. We know that family violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is shaped by the ongoing impacts of colonisation, including state-sanctioned violence and child removal, efforts to eradicate culture and parenting practices, and the enduring systemic racism, disadvantage, and intergenerational trauma. And this includes the continued harm that's caused by child protection systems that do not respond in healing-focused ways to recognise and address the trauma experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and children who are experiencing domestic and family violence. Ultimately, what we know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families need access to both Aboriginal-led services and mainstream services that are skilled and culturally responsive. So there should be a no wrong door approach that allows children to access safe and appropriate responses regardless of where they seek help. So there is, like I mentioned, research currently underway to understand whether the Safe and Together model can be adapted to work well with Aboriginal families. And while the results of this research aren't yet available, it's definitely worth keeping your eye out for. And on that note, I'd like to speak briefly about one of ANROWS' practice frameworks. So ANROWS has published a culturally strong practice framework that was developed by the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection Peak, and that can be used to respond to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who experience domestic and family violence. This framework is called Healing Our Children and Young People. And it was developed out of knowledge generated through research that was led by First Nations community researchers in regional and remote Queensland. This research found that child protection services, education, and health services were failing to promote healing and recovery for First Nations children who had experienced domestic and family violence, and that this was leading to increased harm and to lifelong consequences for these children and for their families. It identified a clear need for First Nations-led approaches to be prioritised and resourced. And while conducting this research, and as a result of those initial findings that revealed the real depth of cultural knowledge and community-led solutions, the research team made a decision to develop this culturally strong practice framework to help guide practitioners and policymakers. So the resulting framework recognises the strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. It supports self-determination and focuses on evidence-based healing responses. It places children at the centre. And a set of principles drawn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values shapes the key actions, ideas, and questions that can be embedded in practice. So we very much recommend that you take a look at that and the research behind it while we wait for those findings to come in regards to Safe and Together as well. I'll just hand over to Sophie now to talk through some of the other frameworks that we have evidence on at ANROWS.
Thanks. So we've talked about some of the benefits of the Safe and Together model this morning, as well as some essential elements to support success. But this model is not the only way to change and guide practice. There are others. And as we just mentioned, other tailored and evidence-based models and practice frameworks do exist. We've just spoken about the practice framework for working with First Nations children and their families. And I'm just going to take you through another two frameworks that have come out of ANROWS' recent children and young people research. So the first one I'm going to discuss is the framework for adolescent violence in the home. So we've mentioned a few times this need to support children and young people who are both experiencing domestic and family violence as victims, but also using violence primarily towards a mother and a sibling. And let's consider this in the case of adolescent violence in the home. That's what we call it. AVITH is the acronym. And it refers to a pattern of violent or abusive behaviours used by an adolescent within their family, mostly against parents, caregivers, and siblings. It doesn't include, when we talk about AVITH, it doesn't include intimate partner violence used by adolescents. So we'll make that clear. It's a huge research and evidence gap. Every time I talk to practitioners in that, they'll talk about AVITH to them. They're like, and what about the stuff about intimate partner teen violence? So I get that. I hear that. I mentioned before that there is this incredibly high rate between young people who use violence being correlated to their experiences of violence, and that it was actually 9 in 10. So 9 in 10 young people using violence have also experienced child abuse themselves. We also know that service and legal systems are just not equipped to deal with this kind of ambiguity. The consequences for young people being labelled as a perpetrator by courts or services can be devastating, can really exclude them from key support such as crisis accommodation, which can force children into further unsafe situations, which there was a question earlier reflecting on some of these unsafe situations. The labelling of young people both experiencing and using violence as a perpetrator and the risks associated with criminalisation can also be weaponised as a form of coercive control by caregivers using domestic and family violence, which can compound and multiply harm. For example, in cases where children are using retaliatory violence in response to a caregiver's use of violence, the caregiver can threaten to involve police. Practitioners have emphasised that service support and legal interventions responding specifically to AVITH are coming 10 years too late. And this is where the AVITH collaborative practice framework can be helpful. This framework was developed out of ANROWS research and outlines pillars, principles, and enablers of collaborative practice to respond to young people and their families who are experiencing adolescent violence in the home. The research found that practitioners and programs were all working incredibly hard to respond to young people and their families experiencing AVITH, but were operating in a service and system context that has limitations. And the findings indicated that work with families experiencing AVITH could be supported by services being sufficiently resourced to allow work with multiple family members, sufficiently flexible to provide for client centered responses, and securing workforces that can be developed over the longer term. So really investing in the workforce. To this end, the research has developed a framework through which policymakers can take responsibility for enablers and practitioners can engage with the core principles of practice, and all involved can base decisions on the foundational pillars so essential to the work. Practice examples rather than discrete recommendations are provided in this framework to support consideration of how you might apply these principles into particular contexts, allowing for that flexibility and responsivity that people need. I'll let you know that these frameworks are available on the ANROWS website, and we will make a list of resources available for everyone today so that you can go through for yourself through these different resources we're talking about. The last framework we're going to discuss is Connecting the Dots Practice Framework. So ANROWS published this framework to guide strengths-based practice when working with children and young people with disability experiencing violence. The framework was developed from an ANROWS research project that found that children with disability make up 30% of children who have experienced violence. And when seeking help for these experiences, they're meeting significant challenges. There's a significant amount of unmet need. So the research found that while families got help from workers and services, they felt lucky when they got good workers, and this didn't always last very long. Workers often had very little time to spend with families and children, and workers were often unsure about how to support people who were experiencing trauma disability, and violence all at once. There were not many examples of workers listening to children and young people with disability about what they wanted, as opposed to listening to adults in their lives about what they want. And many families found navigating confusing and difficult systems too challenging while dealing with violence at home. And everyone agreed, so practitioners, family members, and children agreed that services need to do better, and that those working in services really want to be able to do better. So the Connecting the Dots practice framework is a tool to guide thinking and reflection about how to centre the perspectives and priorities of children and young people with disability experiencing violence. It's designed to be applied across different contexts to support practitioners with ideas about how to respond to and support these children. The framework has 6 key principles that work with children and young people with disability. Should be child responsive. It should be rights focused. It should be trauma informed, which means using approaches that prioritize safety, relationships, trust, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and diversity. It should be inclusive and person centered, recognizing that disability brings strengths and contributions along with the need for support. It should be holistic, working with children and their families to identify their needs, and there needs to be system capacity building underpinned by strong systems, supports, and investment in practitioners and services. I will also add, there is also a really lovely resource developed in response to this project on the ANROWS website that is designed to explain the research findings and what children with disability experiencing violence need in a way that's accessible. It's a kind of resource that you can really sit down and use to talk with family members and with kids about what their experiences look like. So we'll also link to that as well.
All right. So this morning we have taken you through a crash course of some existing models and practice frameworks for working with children and young people experiencing domestic and family violence. So we'd like to take a step back to think about what we can take away from today. Why should you think about using models and practice frameworks in your work? So these frameworks can offer structure to inform and improve the ways of working to better support the safety and well-being of children and their families experiencing domestic and family violence. These frameworks, as we've spoken through, are also based on extensive research with practitioners, children and young people and their families. These frameworks are built using their voices and what they have identified as their needs. And when we work with children and young people, we want to create change. And what better way is there to do that than by championing evidence-based practice and what we're hearing from these children and young people themselves? We also know that we can't expect these models and frameworks to work perfectly every time. So what do we need to consider in their implementation? We need an authorising environment that enables practitioners to use the model. We need appropriate resourcing, training, culture change, and worker safety. And we need to ensure that we tailor the model appropriately to the communities and individuals that we're working with. All of these resources are available online, and we can also provide some links to where you might be able to access training for those. And very much like we've said, thinking about how you can apply those in your own practice. So recommend that you start by just taking a look at those models online and thinking about how they might be able to be integrated, and then searching out that support, and very supportive of the excitement, I guess, around actually how we might be able to apply those. Did anyone in the room have any questions, comments, opening it up to kind of reflections on all of the models, or any outstanding questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet? Thank you.
Thank you. So I just really want to make a point about tailoring and the points about local context and cultural adaptation and just how complex it is. I think we need to acknowledge that it's actually really, really hard work, and we need to be really deliberate and proactive about recruiting a diverse workforce if that tailoring is going to be successful, because we were talking about frameworks and implementation, and they're half the story, and the other half is the cultural competence of the people sitting at the table around with the family, and then being able to really understand and connect in a cultural way. And I think you're more likely to have success if you have a diverse workforce from a gender, from an age, from a cultural and also really important, a religious and faith perspective as well.
That's really, really helpful observation. Thank you. Did anyone else want to add anything before we wrap up? Beautiful. Well, thank you all very much for your openness to having those conversations with each other today. It's been really great for Sophie and I to hear that kind of hum start as soon as we asked the question. We're really glad that you're getting a chance to connect with your colleagues. And like Sophie mentioned earlier, we are really interested to hear what you think. So as we head into lunch, we'd very much welcome you coming up to us, letting us know what you think, what's missing, how we might be able to support. And to those online as well, you're very welcome to reach out to us at ANROWS. We will ask Carolyn to share our contact details with you so that you can contact us directly. Want to take a moment to specifically thank all of those online for joining us. I know it is challenging to sit in front of your computer and focus for this amount of time. So I really hope that this has been useful for you, and for those in the room, thank you very much for being here in person today. I'm going to hand back to Carolyn just to wrap up the session and to let us know the next steps. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Sophie. Really want to thank you both for the extraordinary effort that you've put into preparing this for us today, both in person and online. I think it's been an incredibly valuable experience.